Hello everybody, and welcome to my video on the Ricoh Autoshot. This is an interesting and curious little camera, and so one thing before we get too far, I will tell you that mine is not functional, and that's because the winding mechanism has been sprung and completely messed up, and the spring mechanism in here is jammed completely. So even if that were the case, also the selenium cell in mine is completely shot. So I will show you everything I can on this and also show you how to recognize that the camera is shot. This is a 35mm automatic viewfinder camera, which is kind of a crazy sort of weird thing. And Ricoh used to make really kind of crazy little cameras. What I mean by that is this camera, if it were properly working, you would wind it up, and that would put tension into the springs. You'd take a photo, it would take you'd hit the shutter button, it would take an automatically metered photo and then automatically advance the film. So you could just keep hitting the shutter button over and over and over again, and you would be able to just burn through a roll of film, which was a really good way for somebody on a budget to do something like action shots of their kids' sports or something like that. Also a really good way to not have to worry about remembering to advance the film each time. It has an around the lens selenium light meter. It has a leaf shutter with shutter speeds of a single shutter speed of 1/30th of a second in manual mode, which we'll see what that means in a minute, and 1/125th of a second in automatic mode, as well as bulb. So what that means is that if you're using this camera with a manually selected aperture, it will take a shot at 1/30th of a second only. If you're using it in automatic mode, it will take a shot at 1/125th of a second only. And then, of course, you can also use bulb. The flash sync on this camera is at any of the shutter speeds. And the viewfinder magnification in here is 0.33. It has a really, really tiny viewfinder that is just used for aligning it within the scene. The target market for this camera would have been the entry or casual user, which we know because of the limited capabilities, even though it is got the automatic winding function, and also because it comes with a single wrist strap. This is not the hallmark of professional grade cameras. This is meant to be around someone's wrist so that they can hold the camera, pull it up, take some photos, and set it back, at their side. The full auto mode for this camera was the intended use. This was meant to be functionally an early form of program mode. It only shot at one shutter speed, and it would automatically select the best aperture based on the lighting. And that's so I guess shutter priority would be an even better comparison for this. But it was designed to be a shoot and forget camera that you could use without having to know all of the science behind film. The spring motor in here was designed. And the spring-powered motor in here was capable of being wound up for 10 to 15 shots. What happened with this one, I think, is that somebody wound it up for an entire roll of film and something inside of it broke. I have not taken it apart to try and fix it, and I'm not sure that I will, because the light meter's dead. It wouldn't do me any good to have the mechanism working anyway. At any rate, this was made by Ricoh in Japan from 1964 until very likely 1967. The subsequent camera to this model, which was the Ricoh High Color 35, was released in 1968. It was preceded by the Ricoh 35V, and it was concurrent with a whole range of other Ricoh cameras. Ricoh was not the biggest camera maker in Japan, but they made a lot of cameras at that time, and a lot of them were very interesting and very, very high quality. The old Ricoh cameras of the 60s were fantastic. So now if you have your Ricoh Autoshot, let's go over some of the features and functions of this and see what everything is. On the top of the camera, we have the ISO, or ASA, and DIN dial. Okay, so if you use DIN, if you're in Europe, you would use these red numbers. If you're using the ISO and ASA are the exact same thing. You would just use the black numbers. Now this has a very limited range of 12 to 200, but because each third stop is marked, it seems like it's a much, much bigger range than it actually is. Ricoh Autoshot, and then your hot shoe. Oh, and these numbers over here, if you're not using a filter, you just take your film ISO and you put it to that orange number. If you are using a filter that is colored, so not yellow, because those are generally pretty light, but orange, red, blue, and green, or brown, gross, those don't do good things for your photos. But any of the darker colored ones, or a CPL filter as well, then you would take your ISO and you would set it to the 2. That makes sense. Okay. On the camera's front, we have the shutter release button, the light meter, the viewfinder window, and then the lens assembly. The lens has your shutter speed selection dial, which is auto, bulb, and a manually selected aperture. So if you're shooting with a flash, for instance, you would shoot with a manually selected aperture instead of shooting in full auto mode. And we'll talk about that when we get to the flash section. Then here we have the focus. And the focus is lined up with that orange line. And if you're in auto mode, it's lined up with both orange lines. And so, that's a filter. And so you just, come on, adjust your focus by grabbing the front of the lens and dialing in your focus. It is very stiff on this camera. And that is it on the lens, Ricoh, of course. On the camera's back, we have the viewfinder window here, and we have a scale that converts the symbols on the lens to the distance in meters and feet. So for instance, if you look at the lens's focus, we're going to dial this to full upright person. That is a distance of 16.5 feet, or 5 meters. If we keep dialing this and we go to sitting person, that's a distance of 6.6 feet, or 2 meters. And if we keep going even further to portrait of person, that's 3.3 feet, which is 1 meter. And then of course in between those there are specific distance markings as well that you can use to aid in focus. The symbols also have detents, which will help keep the focus in place for different types of photographs of people. On the camera's bottom, we have the winding knob, film rewind release, frame counter, and film advance knob. Now I know what you're thinking, there is no tripod socket, and that's correct, there isn't. There is. Haha, I lied. On the sides, there's your flash PC port, and there is your tripod socket. This has a 1/4-20 adapter in it, but it looks like the actual tripod socket could be a 3/8/16. And then on this side we have the film back unlock button. We open up the film back, we have the film cassette chamber, which you'll notice is on the wrong side of the camera. Over here we have the shutter window, the frame count and shutter arming sprocket right there. Ooh, did that actually work? Oh, the shutter actually worked. The problem is the winder is jammed. That's why I can't use it. The shutter works, it's just the winder doesn't. Okay, at any rate, then here we have the film take-up spool. Here we have a little guide that helps the film go onto the take-up spool correctly. Film pressure plate right here. And quite interestingly, the film pressure plate has oh, that's not a date cutout, that's for the sprocket. And then we have a this cassette retaining spring, which goes here to keep the film properly aligned. Now obviously, because my winder is completely jammed, cannot show you how the film's going to go through the camera, but you would load the film by pulling the film rewind knob down and post down out, and then putting in your cassette and closing it. And you would pull out a leader and feed it into the film thing here, the film take-up spool, like that. And then when you took a picture, it would theoretically advance the film. Would if it wasn't completely jacked up. Then your film would go through the camera as you take your photos, and then when you rewind the film, you would hold down the film rewind button and rewind the film, and it would just be rewound. Now, a couple points for using this camera is that film is one and done. So don't open your camera back when you have film in it, because you will erase all of your photos or ruin your film and prevent it from ever being able to take more photos. So once you have your film in it, close your camera back, advance through your whole roll of film, then rewind it entirely. Rewind it so that you don't have a leader, because if you leave a leader, that makes it very easy to accidentally reuse this film and get double exposures. It could ruin all of the frames. Then pull the film out. And if you are done shooting for the day, just trigger the shutter until the winder stops advancing the film, and then you will know that you have used up the winder power and you're not storing it with any tension on the springs, because everything in here is mechanical and clockwork, and when you advance the winder you put tension on these springs. And if you leave that tension on those springs for days or months or years at a time, it can fatigue them and cause them to develop a memory which will throw off your shutter timing, or worse, render your camera completely inoperable. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how to use a flash on this camera. There are two ways to connect the flash, with the hot shoe or the PC port. And this camera will sync your flash at any speed. In terms of flashes, it just uses a basic flash. So whatever inexpensive, either brand new flash you can buy or used like an old Vivitar will work just fine. There are some tips for using a flash that I have for you. Let's pretend that this studio light is a flash. If you set the flash here, this is basically the worst spot for a flash. The light leaves the flash, reaches your subject, bounces back to the film, and will cause them to look, your subjects to look flat and waxy. If you think about the way that we see people, or anything that we ever see, most things anyway, if we're outside, we're underneath the sun. If we're inside, we have lights in the ceiling above us. If we're outside at night, then the street lights above us shine light down onto us. So our brains are used to seeing things being lit from above, and that looks natural to us. So you can set yourself up for success and set your subjects up to have flattering images if you replicate that natural lighting condition. And what you want to do to replicate that light is to have your flash bounce off of the ceiling. So if you get an articulating flash and you bounce the light up to the ceiling, down to your subject, and back to your lens, then your flash is going to replicate having that natural looking overhead lighting. And that's just a really good way to use your flash. There are flashes that have articulating heads that move up and down, and also ones that rotate. And you can get ones with rotating and articulating heads for fairly low prices today, and it's a really good way to use the flash to the maximum ability with this camera. So let's talk a little bit more about the lens and the markings. Oh, one other thing, when using the flash, you want to make sure that you are setting it to one of these specific apertures, either 2.8, 4.5, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, or 22. Every other aperture is marked on the ring. And by doing that, you will use the 1/30th of a second shutter speed, which is what you want to use for your flash. And then you are going to control your light level reaching your film with your aperture. So using a flash with this camera does require a little bit of math ability and calculating the flash guide number versus your shutter speed, subject distance, and aperture. Okay. That's outside the scope of this video and would be a good subject for it. And there are many, many videos about that, including one of my own. So at any rate, you don't want to use the flash in auto mode. You can also use the flash in bulb mode, but that's only going to use f2.8, if I remember. To use the lens, we've talked about focusing it. In auto mode, the camera will fire at 1/125th of a second. I think I got that. Yeah, 1/125th of a second. And it will pick the best aperture from f2.8 to f22 based on the meter reading coming from the meter. If your meter is dead, your only option is to shoot this in manual aperture selection at 1/30th of a second, and then just pick the best shutter speed based on your 1/30th of a second shutter speed, or to use bulb. Auto mode will only shoot wide open if the meter is dead. Okay, so you could also put it to auto mode and shoot 1/125th of a second wide open. So having a dead meter does severely limit this camera's ability to take good photos. Okay, and that's really it. That's how you adjust the dial. That's how you read the different settings on the lens focus. We talked about that. So really a pretty intuitive and user-friendly interface that's fairly simple to use. So how do you take a photo with this camera? Once you've got the film loaded, you would dial your ISO in so that the film speed aligns with the orange triangle. Then you would pre-tension your winder a little bit here. And then when you're ready to take a photo, just assuming you're in auto mode, you look through the viewfinder to frame your shot, and then you take a picture, and that takes your shot. If you're going to be using a flash or you want to manually control your aperture for a specific reason, you would just do that, and then you would take your shot. Same thing with bulb. If you're doing a very long exposure for something like star trails, or for using a flash in a pitch black room to freeze motion, you would just do that with bulb. There you go. And so it's very easy. Double exposures cannot be done with this camera because of the winding mechanism here. So this is not a camera that's going to allow you to do that. So a couple of things not to do with your Ricoh Autoshot. Don't store the camera with the shutter mechanism wound up or the shutter ready to fire. Take the tension off of both of those when you're done shooting for the day, because as you can see, that can have ramifications for the camera's ability to be functional. Don't get the camera wet. It is all metal, and the internal components will rust together, and that will ruin your camera as well. And just remember that your Ricoh Autoshot is a precision tool and should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.